Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, author of numerous novels and nonfiction books, and glad to be here tonight.
I am Molly Jo Reilly. I am author of The Unemployment Cookbook, the upcoming mystery location novel NOLA, and producer of the First in Fiction podcast.
And we do want to remind all of you listening to the audio-only version of our podcast, you can listen live, 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time is when we record on Tuesday evenings. You can add us to your circles, firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com. That way you'll get the notifications. And if you are watching on YouTube, thank you very much. We do ask that you'd hit that little thumbs up button. Helps us out quite a bit. Go ahead and like us and subscribe to us. Again, approaching that magical number of 100 subscribers. Tell your friends about us. We'd really, really appreciate that. And Molly, you've got some news about some new books.
I do. We all have some new books available, and that's pretty exciting. Al just released his book, Unspoken, which we talked about last week, or I think you guys, was it last week? I don't know. I wasn't here last week. Mm-hmm. Somebody spoke about something. So it's now available on Amazon. Al, do you want to give a little shout out on that?
Sure. Not too much, though. We did talk about it last week. Unspoken is a small nonfiction book, roughly the size of a book that William Jennings Bryan put out about a speech that he never delivered, and that's what the book is about. Unspoken is a speech he was meant to deliver in the Scopes trial at the end of the trial to the jury. He got outmaneuvered, so it was never given in court. It was repeated a few times before he died. He died 5 days after the court case was over. And anyway, that was published as a book. So I talk about the Scopes trial. I talk about some of the things that went on behind, some of the societal things, and then I do a sort of a friendly analysis of what William Jennings Bryan did. So I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, and it's not typical to what I normally write, but this is one of those things I did for myself. So, and I sell it for a few pennies on all the places now, so you can get it on Amazon, iBooks, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Smashwords, all of those places.
Well, it does sound like an interesting book, and I'm going to pick it up next week, for sure, for sure. And Aaron, you have the next Hand of Adonai book coming out in less than 2 weeks, yes?
It is coming up quickly, and I've been so busy with so many other things. I keep forgetting that it's releasing this month, but I am very excited about it. The second book in the Hand of Adonai series, called The Blood Sword. It's available for pre-sale on Amazon, and you can just find it by searching The Blood Sword by Aaron Gansky. Should pop up for you. And I'm looking forward to it. I know a lot of people have really been waiting to see the next chapter, proverbial chapter in the series, and so I'm happy to deliver that, and I'm eager to see some reactions from folk who've read the book, the first book, and enjoyed it. So excited about that. But you also, Molly Jo, recently published a book, Crowdfunding Your Way to Success. So what? I mean, the title seems self-explanatory, unless you're throwing us a curveball here. What is that about?
No, that is exactly what it is. When I first published The Unemployment Cookbook, and again most recently when I needed to get my laptop replacement, I did crowdfunding campaigns for both of those. And it was really great because people were asking me afterwards, how did I do it? What tips and techniques did I use? And I thought, that could actually be something helpful. Since the computer, I kind of consider it a little bit of community property because so many people did chip in to help me get that through the crowdfunding. This was my way of giving back to the community, and I put it up. I wrote it's a 26-page little booklet with tips and tricks on how to make a successful crowdfunding campaign, what works, what doesn't, particularly for creative people, not those who are necessarily looking to help pay bills for medical needs or something, although you can use that as well, but mostly for the creative people looking to do pre-sales and to help boost, like musicians who need studio production time, writers who are looking to pre-sell their books, that sort of thing. And that is also on Amazon for $1.49.
Nice, very nice. So, Glad to hear it. Very exciting news. Everybody's got books coming out, so stay tuned to the podcast. We'll kind of give you, hopefully next week we'll have some information about the book launch for The Blood Sword, which again in a couple of weeks should be out and ready for you guys. And we'll try and keep you updated next week on that. Our Ask the Author question tonight comes from Chris, old friend of mine, and he contacted me through Facebook and also aarongansky.com, and he asks, when it comes to editing, would you and do you use an editing service? If so, who do you use for this, and who would you recommend? So that's a very good question. I feel like we've done an entire episode on editors, what to look for, the types of services they provide, those types of things. I do recommend using an editor or an editing service for most writers, especially for new writers. If you've been around the block a few times, you might be able to get away without a really solid, well, you still need a really solid edit. However, if you've been doing it for a number of years, you're going to have a pretty acute eye. If you're in a critique group, that might work for you. If you're a member of some sort of writing club and as a critique group, many eyes will be able to see several mistakes. But I still think it helps to have an outside pair of eyes to go over your work. And the reason is the people who, especially in critique groups, they're going to see your work often, and they're going to see different variations of it, and they're going to become just as blind to mistakes in your work as you are. And if you ask any writer, they'll tell you they become blind to the mistakes in their own work, and there's psychological reasons for that, mainly because your brain fills in the blanks that are not on the page. And so it's really easy to overlook things. Now, if you're new to the game, though, you really want to make sure that you're making a good first impression. You've got no books under your belt. You want to make sure that you are sending publishers as clean of copy as humanly possible. Now, that means you may not hire an editor to do your entire novel, which would be costly, but if you're doing a proposal, which is much, much shorter, you might have them look at that. And then if somebody picks that up, maybe you can have, well, if somebody picks it up, then they'll have editors that look at it. So in terms of who I recommend, most of the editors I know have gone into writing, and they're focusing on their own writing now and not taking new clients. So I would do some Google research, find a service or a person with good reviews, with reasonable rates, with a good track record. Contact the people that they've worked with and get opinions on them, and that way you can make sure that you're going to be hiring somebody who's going to polish up your vision rather than necessarily trying to change your vision. So that's what I would think. The other good way to find editors is by attending writers' conferences, making those personal connections with editors. And you'll find them there. You'll find plenty of them there, and they will be able to recommend good people for you. That's what I would say. Pops, how about you?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. This can be a tough call to make because hiring a good editor, while a great idea, is going to require the layout of some money. Very few people are going to want to do it for free, and if they are, then you may want to ask why they want to do it for free, unless they're bosom buddy or something like that. And even if you do hire an editor, let me kind of give the flip side here, and you place your book with a publisher, the publisher is going to have it edited in three forms of edit. So very quickly, there's a macro edit, that's the big picture. There's a line edit where lines and paragraphs are being fixed so that they're as clear as can be. Then there's copy edit, and those are the people that focus on things like misuse of semicolons and dangling participles and misplaced modifiers and stuff like that that we get blind to while we're writing, which are so easy to find in anyone else's writing. Very hard to find in our own. It's part of the human psychology. So you're going to get an edit anyway if you're able to get into the a publishing house. So the question is, you want to put money out up front and never see a return on it unless you're planning on self-publishing, which is always an option if you don't get a publisher, in which case you do want an editor. Just also know that editors will vary in their opinions on things, and that's because grammar has fewer hard and fast rules than most people realize. We think that everything's cast in concrete. It's not. All you have to do is compare Chicago Manual of Style, which is normally used for books. That'd be one of your questions for the editor if it's a book that you're turning into them. What is their style guide? And it should be Chicago Manual of Style for a book. Journalistic things, articles, that's usually AP, Associated Press, and there's a lot of differences between those two. So it's a myth to think that there's a hard and fast rule and there's only one way to write a sentence, or only one way to use a hyphen, or only a proper way to use commas, or heavy comma people, light comma people. So don't be surprised if it varies. And so if you are going to hire an editor, and there's certain things you like you hate semicolons, you can ask them to look for semicolons. I love semicolons, and so I will tell an editor, don't take them out. They're there for a reason. They don't frighten me. But then again, I tend to be someone who uses more commas than those who are light comma users. When it goes through the edit, especially at a publisher, if my copy editor is taking commas out, I don't really care. It's not a hill to die for.
Well said. And you also mentioned here in the show notes, Pops, that if they're self-publishing, that hiring an editor makes sense. I would go so far as to say that if you're self-publishing, hiring an editor is a necessity, that you absolutely have to have an editor, because if you publish something and there are numerous errors, it's going to really turn your reader off, and they're very likely to not buy something else that you've done. So you want to make a very good impression on your reader. If you're sending out to publishers, you want to make a good impression on the publishers. If you're sending out directly to readers, you want to make a good impression on readers. Readers will, if they like what you've done, they'll read pretty much anything you've written. If they don't like what you've done, they'll probably never buy another book. You get really one shot, and that's generally going to be your first work. After you have several works out, that may change, but for the most part, they'll make up their mind on one book.
And don't expect the editor to catch everything. It's a numbers game. If you write a full-length novel, you're going to have maybe 100,000 words, depending on the genre. Little as 80,000 maybe. You might have 200,000 or more, depending on the genre. But to keep the numbers easy, you have 100,000 words, so if you're 99% accurate, you've got 1,000 mistakes at the word level. That's not at the letter level, like in a typo, but you've got 1,000 mistakes. So if you're 99.9% correct, you still have 100 of those babies in your book. So if you're 99.99%, you still have 10. So usually first editions have those kinds of mistakes in them. They get fixed with each subsequent edition. Now the thing about self-publishing is some people will let you know, hey, you got the wrong there. You meant T-H-E-I-R, and there you put T-H-E-R-E, and you say, thank you. You're a word detective, and I'll fix it right now, and you can publish it right away again without that error. So no one else buying in the future gets it. So that is the advantage in the self-publishing.
Quick story before Molly Jo jumps in with her answer here. I use the word here. I recently put out a proposal for a sci-fi that I'm writing, and I gathered some trusted friends to do some reading for me, just the first 3 chapters, and I asked them very kindly and politely if they would read through it and correct whatever mistakes are there, because I didn't want to embarrass myself. And so, since it was such a small amount of pages, got quite a few people who were willing to look at it. Pops, thank you. And my wife was looking through it, and she says, do you want me to mark the typos or just like make global comments? I was like, what typos? So you used the wrong here. You meant H-E-A-R and H-E-R-E, and I thought, oh man, where is that? So she told me, and I fixed it. I must have gotten back 7 or 8 different sets of comments. Nobody else caught that particular mistake.
That's right.
But then, Pops, you found stuff that nobody else found. And so when you've got something like 7 or 8 people looking at it, 6 of them are going to have the same things to say, but at least 5 or 6 of them are going to have unique catches that nobody else does. So having, that's kind of the critique group style, where you have multiple eyes looking at the same passage. You can catch a lot of stuff that way. But again, Still can't catch everything because on my return trip to it, I still found things that everybody else had missed.
Yeah.
So editing, yeah, go ahead, Pops.
I republished some of my earlier stuff, and I have books that have gone through three copy edits as well as the other edits before that, and mistakes still get in there. It's just going to happen, and you just can't be too worried about it. It happens, and I've mentioned this before. Fitzgerald had 100 mistakes in one of his early books. That's 100. It made him a bestseller because it became a game. I don't suggest that, but they're always going to be there. Hopefully, you won't make some of the kind of dumb mistakes I've made that editors have caught. I keep a list of them because my dumb mistakes make sense, and they come back to haunt me. And usually it's just one letter in the wrong place, and then I'm embarrassed for the rest of my life on some of them. So, yeah, no one's going to catch all of them. There's stuff going to get through, and just like you find them when you read someone else's work, they're going to find them in yours.
I feel like one of our wild card episodes should be all of the typos that we've had in our books.
No.
I'm sure we could fill an hour with that. No, you don't think so?
Well, first of all, there's not too many typos in my cookbook, and that's, I haven't published NOLA yet, so we're not discussing that.
So, Molly, what about you? Do you suggest editing?
No, never. I think editing is just, no, of course I do. I strongly recommend hiring a professional editor, and I'm not saying that just because I am also a professional editor. Regarding selecting it, my first criteria is, and yes, I have other people who are reading NOLA and helping me out, and they are professional editors, but also, Aaron, you're not an editor, you're a mentor, and you've been reading it. Al, it goes back to what you were saying about people who prefer certain types of punctuation. Here's a not so secret, but Aaron hates ellipses, and I love them.
I don't know if I
love them. And
let me just say this about that. Aaron's wrong. Okay, go ahead.
Here's the thing about hang on. Here's the thing about ellipses.
This was my time. I was quiet for like 5 minutes. I thought, go ahead, Aaron. Yeah,
that's what an ellipsis sounds like.
Yeah, and it's supposed to. That's why my character thinks out loud a lot, and so she does not complete her thoughts. That's why the ellipses are there. It's not like she's lost her space or her thought process. It's that there's no reason to continue the sentence. I love ellipses. Anyway, so make sure that when you do hire an editor, you negotiate what your preferences are compared to what is required. One of my criteria for selecting an editor is their social media. If their posts or typos seem disjointed, or if there's a lot of errors in what they put up on their Facebook posts, they're not the editor for me. And also vice versa, if I'm taking on a writing client, I will check out their social media. If an author comes to me and says, will you edit my manuscript? I hope that they put enough effort into their Facebook posts and their Twitter feeds that it's not laden with typos, because if it is, I'm going to charge you double, because now you don't need an editor, you need a rewrite. So there's different ways to consider what's going on. Your professional presence or your internet presence is a big factor into your professional reputation. It's just careless, in my opinion. I would also recommend, if you're not sure who to hire, ask your writing friends who they recommend. Like Aaron and Al were saying, attend the conferences, Google people online, and go ahead and, I didn't put this in the show notes, but research books of your genre that you like and reach out. A lot of smaller publishing firms have editors in the wings that are waiting for new projects, or they have a lead on editors where they're not associated, but they know, a friend of a friend is a freelance editor trying to break into the business. You can get a discount or a lower rate by hiring an editor who is just starting out, as opposed to somebody who's been editing professionally for 10 years. So depending on what your finances are and what your project is, reach out to active editors that you know and respect or come highly recommended, and tell them your situation and ask them what would they recommend. Who would they recommend?
Well said. I do want to talk about the ellipses just for a moment
I knew
because
you
it brings up a
would.
good
I knew
point,
we
and
were
that's
going to
just
circle
simply
back to that.
stylistic choices, right? I had an editor who was putting exclamation points into my novel, and I had to go through and take them out. And we ended up going to the publisher with it to say who is right, and it was a stylistic choice. And so when you're looking at an editor, you'll probably want to find somebody who's familiar with your style, who appreciates your style, and will work to brighten that style and kind of accentuate that style, rather than somebody who's going to constantly be trying to undermine you by adding more commas when you don't want them or taking commas away when you do want them, those types of things. So for the most part, if it's not a hill to die on, it's not a big thing. I happen to think ellipses are overused. That's my own thing. Pops has disagreed with me, and Molly has disagreed with me, and they're entitled to be wrong. That's fine. It's a free country, so.
No, I'm not saying it's good to
I'm
overuse
sorry.
them.
I'm just throwing people under the bus.
I'm not saying they're good to be
Same
good
as
to
always.
overuse. I'm just saying that they have their
Yes.
place. All right, I tell
They
you
do have
what,
their
we need to
place.
talk about
Yeah.
settings.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, it's a good thing the show notes
we
are a little
are-
short this week.
Exactly. So we're talking about setting, and to be clear on what setting entails, most people think, oh, setting is the place where your novel takes place. It is, but it's also has to do with the time that your novel takes place, and the circumstances in which your story takes place. All three things: time, setting, time, place, and circumstances are vitally important. They're equally important. I trying to remember, I think it was Brett Anthony Johnston, and I had written a short story for him, and he read it, and he said, "Where does this take place?" And I thought, well, wherever you want it to take place. It's normal mid-American town, like nobody knows. And he says, well, that's wrong, because a love story is in New York is not a love story in L.A., is not a love story in Georgia in 1962. Etc. And so you get this idea that a typical romance, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, is going to play out differently in 1920s LA than it would in again, the 60s in the South, or even on Jupiter in the year 2222, whatever the case is. It's going to be different. And so what we want to talk about today is establishing the time of your novel, placing it in a particular day, a particular era, etc. Consider the following when thinking about establishing time within your novel, and you do need to do that. You have to establish the place, but also the time. It has to take place in a particular time as well as a particular place. You've got to have them both. Don't fall into the anytown trap that I had done. Don't fall into the anytime trap that I had done. I remember reading a science fiction story, and on page 32 there was some sort of fantastic technology that didn't seem to exist on the first 30 pages, and I thought, oh, I guess we're in the future, but I had already assumed that it was a contemporary novel. So I was thrown a little bit for a loop there. You want to come up with a specific time, specific place, specific set of circumstances for your story to take place. Molly, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I had a question when I read the show notes on that. I've had people caution me about dating my novel, and that is saying don't be too specific with time and the elements. For instance, referencing my characters using a smartphone. They said be careful of that because a smartphone is a dated piece of technology. How can a writer create a timeless story if we have to incorporate a time? But also, in hearing you explain it, it makes me think of the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is such a classic and is considered timeless, and yet it's very distinctly 1960s New York. What do either of you recommend with how can you do that? How can you add time but make it timeless?
Well, I don't know if there's just a misunderstanding of what they mean by dating. Dating your story. A timeless story is a timeless story because of the characters and the action. It has nothing to do in the what era that it appears in. A Civil War story can be timeless, and to take it out of the Civil War does not make it any better. Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime with this young married couple takes place in the 20s. It's the Jazz Age. The BBC's recently done one where they put them in the 40s, the World War II era. And the story does not hold up. It needs to be back in the mid to late 20s, early 30s for that couple to work out because things had changed so much because of the war. So I disagree with that idea of dating things. Now, I know it can be a problem. Michael Crichton did this with one of his books, the one with the apes. And anyway, he has a guy carrying a computer in a backpack into the jungle to find these very rare, intelligent apes. And he describes all the equipment because that's what Michael Crichton did. And it's antiquated. You couldn't run anything on it today. And when I remember reading that, thinking that probably ought to be updated, and I think ultimately he did update it. But I had no problem with it because I knew when the story was set. So if you make the era clear, technology won't be a problem. Just be consistent in the technology. I don't think it'll keep a book from being timeless. I don't think you can have a nice piece of fiction that has no time relevance at all.
Got it.
I agree. And one of the mistakes that the most common mistake is going to be not adding enough specific detail. If you're going to talk about specific details, the things that you can experience with your five senses, to develop a place for the setting, you need to do the same thing with time. How has it changed? New York City looks vastly different now than it did in the 40s. Think of we've been taking this summer to rewatch all the Marvel movies, and so we watched Captain America not too long ago, the first one, and he goes, falls into ice, and he falls asleep in the 40s, and he wakes up in New York, same town that he left, but now it looks a lot different 70 years later, and he has to kind of come to grips with that. And so, same location, completely different time, completely different sensory experience there. And on that note, you want to make sure that your characters are going to determine what you, the writer, are going to pay the most attention to. If they're American, they're likely going to be concerned with American events. A journalist will be well versed in current events, and they're going to be talking about those things. But maybe they're just a painter, and they don't pay attention to world events, political events, but they know all of the impressionists, and they know all the other trends in art, because that's what they pay attention to. So how do you do that? Well, you find the popular painters of the particular era in which you're setting your story. Again, paying attention to detail. I read a book in which somebody went to Las Vegas in the 80s and went to see Penn and Teller perform. And I thought, well, that's strange because they didn't start performing in Las Vegas till the following decade. Paying attention to those little things, got the feel of the town right, but got that little bit of time wrong. Instead, you just, what was the most popular show in Las Vegas in the 1980s? I'm sure Google knows, probably David Copperfield or something. And so he could have just swapped out Penn and Teller with David Copperfield and his story would be fine. But paying attention to that kind of stuff. These are people who were interested in entertainment. They wanted to see the town, and that's what they were paying attention to. Again, if they're a journalist, they're paying attention to world events. If they are, a child, they're probably not paying attention to who's running for president. So those types of things are going to really determine what you spend the most time developing.
Well, you just said something which led up to my next comment. You said like a child's not going to pay attention to presidential elections. Is it possible for a character to identify or reach for something outside of their own individual, in their own personal world? Like you were saying, I don't really quite know how to explain it. Like, let's say I have a journalist who's drawn to, could their focus be on the art instead of journaling? If you have a politician, could their interest be on botany instead of the political realm of Washington, D.C.? How would you write that? Are there successful examples of books having been done where a character denies themselves basically and reaches out into the world for elements that are unfamiliar and uncomfortable to them?
Yeah, you absolutely can do that, and there are several good examples of it that I can't think of off the top of my head, but there you're just going to have a more well-rounded character, and that's fine, and that's good, and that makes them interesting. When you've got a mechanic who dropped out of medical school, not because it was too hard, but because it's just not what he wants to do with his life, too much stress or whatever the case may be. Or his dad wanted him to be a doctor, so he's rebelling against that and became a low-income mechanic or whatever the case is. Yeah, they may still know all sorts of biology and all the biomedical technological advancements, etc. But also they're well-versed in the auto world as well. So yeah, you can do that. And I didn't mean to imply that it's going to be the exclusive thing that you're going to develop, but that it's probably going to be the thing that they're most concerned with, that is most developed. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
All right. Dodge that bullet. Pops,
yeah,
you want to do
national and world events? Yeah, but we're going to circle back to the ellipses later, so I'm just warning you now.
Yeah, national and world events are very important if they're close to the time that you're setting your story in. And you bring up this idea here that can you imagine setting a novel in 1942 and not mentioning Pearl Harbor, which happened just a few months before in December of 1941, or not talking about World War II at all. It would be very difficult to do. Of course, Ernest Hemingway dealt with some of that in some of his books. Mm-hmm. You have to mention that. It's always interesting to me. If you watch old Murder, She Wrote episodes, there's a time when Jessica Fletcher moves to New York for much of the year, and you see the trade towers there, the twin trade towers, and it's a difficult thing to see because it jars me to being reminded about what happened there. Yet that story set at a time before that, so it then becomes a marker that okay, this is a different time, and the United States is a different place. That event changed everything. So whatever comes after that would have to be different. So if there are world events, national events, then you should pay attention to them if they're close in time. That doesn't necessarily mean that, if you're writing about somebody who's living in 1945, may not just be back from the war, may have never gone to the war, so it may be something else, but at least you need to know that it's there, and it may play some role in the rest of the story. So, but I also want to say this, and not every story needs a well-known climactic event in it. It could be a very local thing. So I'm thinking of, say, a flood in the Amish community that destroys many of the houses, or a freeway that runs right by, maybe through part of Amish communities, and the whole story about how that came to be. How do the Amish deal with that? So from a worldwide point of view, that's not a big event. If you're an Amish who's been on that land for generations, well, then it is a big event, and then that's the story in itself. So sometimes the microcosm is as important as the macrocosm of a story.
Well said, Pops. And yeah, you said it well. You don't have to have one of these climactic events, but they do tend to define generations, and they almost become a line of demarcation. The America we know now is very different than the pre-2001 America. And I'll relay this story just because I think it's interesting, but I was sitting with a buddy of mine. This was years ago. I mean, how old are we now? Sitting with a buddy of mine shortly after college, or while we were getting our credentials, our teaching credentials. And he looks to me and goes, "Man, Aaron, we're old." So what are you talking about? We're old. Like, we're still in college. We're getting our degrees. We're not old. And he goes, I was sitting in class, and this girl looked at this guy and said, "You were born in the 70s?" I was like, oh, man. And I was like, well, sure there are some younger kids here, but whatever. And he goes, no. He goes, "Aaron, these kids don't remember the Challenger." And I went, okay. I'm now old. Like, that put it into perspective for me, because I remember exactly where I was when the Challenger, when that whole thing happened. And but they tend to define generations, and it doesn't have to play a major part in your story, but just knowing what post-2001 America looks like versus pre-2001 America looks like versus 1941 America looks like, knowing that is going to help inform how the characters around your character are going to act and to interact. So if for no other reason, you should be familiar with those just for the sake of backdrop, background information. You don't have to make it a big part, but just at least make it a part. The same can kind of be said for pop culture. Some characters are really going to care about it. Other characters are not. Molly Jo, you were talking about dating a novel and with the use of, say, technology and the smartphone, but you could do the same thing with pop culture. You can absolutely date a novel with it. What songs are in the jukebox? Is there even a jukebox? Has your character ever heard of a jukebox?
There's always a jukebox.
You know, what movies
Aaron.
are playing in the...
There's always a jukebox somewhere.
Always. There's always. I remember this latest X-Men movie in which it's supposed to take place in the 80s, and one of the ways that they demonstrated that was having people walking out of the Return of the Jedi. Or was it Empire Strikes Back? I think it must have been Return of the Jedi. Anyhow, so okay, that's a popular movie of the 80s, so that makes sense. You know, who's winning the Grammys? Who's winning the Oscars? Who's hot? Who's not? These types of pop culture references, as long as you're not overdoing it, can be helpful. They can really lend a lot of development to who your character is, what type of music they listen to, what kind of shows they watch, those types of things. If you think of the movie Back to the Future, one of the things that we like is the clock tower, because it shows how Marty can use his future knowledge in a world that doesn't understand Johnny Be Good, right? And so you get that music part there at the end, and his love for music, and even though he's not dropping a lot of names of bands, it is kind of a memorable moment when he goes out and he plays Johnny Be Good. Make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was saying that another trick that I use is to do the opposite. My novel Nola takes place in modern day New Orleans, but the heritage and history warrants the frequent mention of older music such as jazz or the Rat Pack or Otis Redding, and classic foods as well as locations. My character really dislikes the collision of bright history and steely skyscrapers and tries to stay in one area so she can just immerse herself in the history and not have to deal with modern society. But she is modern. It is current times. So there's that little bit of conflict going on, and I like to show that between the two of them. Is that also, does that work generally, or does that, what am I trying to say? Is that a good way to use time elements in a story?
I think so. Yeah, I think
good,
so.
Because otherwise there's 17 chapters going to be rewritten really soon.
Well, I think it's important, especially if other characters mention it. Like, she's listening to Frank Sinatra, and they're like, "Are you 80 years old?" or whatever it is. I had a student a couple of years ago who just loved to talk about MASH and the I Love Lucy show and all these other television shows that were, that Pops, you grew up watching. And here she is, a high school student, and I'm like, those are before my time. Like, what? You're watching those? Why? Like, what about all these other television shows and movies and things of that nature? And she's like, yeah, I'm not into them. It can really develop character. But what makes that interesting is not that she's watching I Love Lucy in the 60s. She's watching I Love Lucy in the 2010s. And that's helps to build the character, but you can also develop the rest of the world around them, saying it's kind of archaic that you're watching those types of shows. So it can work kind of both ways there and really help develop your character as well as the setting. Kind of a 2-for-1 there.
Whew. Great, thanks.
So,
dodged that bullet.
Yeah.
You're almost forgiven for the ellipses.
There you go.
Almost.
All right, that was a very verbal ellipsis. So, Pops, I'd like you to handle the fashion section here.
Yeah, right, because I'm so good with fashion.
The Gansky runway.
Fashion does, and clothing does play a part in setting. And we're focusing primarily on times and eras in the like. So if you have somebody wearing a zoot suit, well, then you set the time era pretty clear. Unless he's a one-off and no one else in the world wears zoot suits, then you set a character more than just a setting. So flappers, for example, tell us we're in the 1920s. Gibson girls, which came before the flappers. Very modest, lots of clothes. It's the opposite of being a flapper. And then get into the wonderful, wonderful 70s with hot pants and mini skirts and tie-dyed shirts and all of those things. Love beads, all those things set an era. So you can certainly do that with what people wear or refuse to wear. But that means that you, as the writer, then must take the time to learn about these things, especially if you didn't grow up with them. So I'm old enough; I wouldn't have a problem writing about the hippie culture, or the conservative movement that grew out of part of the hippie culture as a response to the hippie culture. I wouldn't have any problem writing about what's going on in the 70s and stuff because I was still alert. But it's a question about whether or not I'm still alert now. But back then, I was, still alert to those kinds of things. But if you're crossing gender in your stories about what, say, you're a male writing about what a woman wore then, or you're a woman writing about what a man wore then, you're probably going to have to do a little research and maybe get a little help. And the first time I had a female protagonist, I needed a lot of help because I'm just a guy. We have shoes, we have pants, we have shirts. That's pretty much it. We got white socks and dress socks, and that's pretty much it for most of us anyway. Women, I don't know. There's mules and spectator pumps and slingbacks, and you need to do. Yeah, you need to agree to know how to just pick out a shoe, and I didn't know any of those things. I didn't know the terms for clothing. I knew what a blouse was. That was pretty much it. So my wife helped me out quite a bit. She took me by the hand, took me to a woman's shoe store. Boy, that was quite the adventure for me, and started teaching me what the different shoes were, and then clothing, and then of course I use catalogs, and this is where I think Aaron wants me to tell a funny story. As he walked in, I had all these catalogs of women's clothing open and studying them. And he walked through the door and he said, "Hey, Dad, I've got," and he stopped. An ellipsis came out of his mouth, and he looked around, and then he looked at me and he said, "Dad, do we need to talk?" I'm doing research, that's where I learned what a shell top was. I didn't know. I had to get help on those kinds of things, and so I use catalogs and this stuff. Now, if you're writing historical stuff, you may have to look at old newspapers, old magazines. That's a great place, a great find in antique stores, as you can find old magazines from different periods. You can see what's being advertised. So, yeah, you want to get the fashion right because there'll be somebody who will call you on it. Jack Kavanaugh made a mistake. He used to write a lot of historical novels, and he had a woman tying her shoe in an era when they didn't tie shoes, they buttoned shoes. And he got called on it.
Whoops.
So it happens. We make little mistakes like that. Most people won't catch it, but you at least want to try to get rid of those mistakes, avoid them.
Pops, when I tell that story about coming in and seeing you with all those catalogs, I always put the word research in quotes. Like I'm just doing research. Just adds a little flavor to the story there. But yeah, it was a fun time, and I've caught myself doing that, just googling women's fashion
clothing?
1965 or whatever. And
Do we need to talk?
fashion. I use the term fashion, and no, I'm not looking at Amazon. Just googling. There's a difference here. So.
Okay, sure.
So you think of fashion, you think of world events, you also pop culture. You also want to think of technology, and this is a favorite of the sci-fi writer. So if you are doing a science fiction, obviously you're going to have to project what the future might look like, and come up with some new technological gadgets, which can take a lot of research. Now there's two different types of sci-fi. There's the kind of the Star Wars sci-fi, which is almost more fantasy than it is science fiction. It's just kind of like, hey, we've got these neat little light swords, and there's laser cannons, and hooray, but there's not a lot of actual science behind it. You've got stuff like Star Trek, which is, projects what might be possible in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, whatever it is in front of us. As a matter of fact, I like both Star Wars and Star Trek. I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but a lot of our recent technological advancements, i.e. your smartphone, Molly Jo, is the direct descendant of inspiration that came from Star Trek, because a lot of the technology that's used there has inspired inventors to try and create like things that are like that. MRIs, imaging devices that weren't really around in the 60s are now done in the palm of somebody's hand with a tricorder, those types of things. So you can use technology. Pops, you were mentioning Congo, in which case he had this really advanced computer that now just looks silly to us. But at the time that Congo released, it helped develop, oh, this guy's cutting edge, like we don't have that technology yet. He must be on the super cutting edge of technology. But again, if you're writing historically, you want to make sure that you are being accurate. In your World War II novel and you've got somebody calling on the cell phone, there's a problematic there. Or dialing on a phone. I don't think you would dial during the 40s. I think the phones there are still rotary, I would imagine, right? It was rotary phones up through the... When did we get push buttons? Was that the 70s or 80s? I don't know.
70s, I think.
Yeah, push buttons came in, I think, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, I was watching Stranger Things on Netflix, and it's supposed to take place in I think the early 80s, and she's got a rotary phone. And I'm thinking, rotary phone in the 80s? And my wife was like, yeah, they were around. And I was like,
they were
really?
Around.
Rotary phones? Yeah, I guess they were around, but not necessarily popular. But those types of things. Again, future, just project, do a little bit of research. I've been doing that since I was writing that sci-fi. I had to kind of think ahead. What does the automotive industry look like in 70 years? What does the space administration look like in 70 years? What does weaponry look like in 70 years? So I had to do a lot of research on that to kind of come up with something that's believable. That's basically believable. That's going to help establish my setting. So.
And I was going to say I recommend double checking your information too. If you're writing historically, don't rely on just one source or website for details. We all know that the internet is full of information. The internet is also full of misinformation. So make sure that you can actually verify your facts. Just because one person leads you down a rabbit hole does not mean it's an accurate rabbit hole or rabbit trail, whatever the proper phrase is. And also, if you're writing in the future, try to keep it plausible. Even though you're creating something, keep it plausible. That is, a cell phone chip isn't going to pop out of my cat's eye if I crank her tail. At least I hope not. So you want to make sure if there's ways to communicate in the future, it's plausible. It's not going to... People aren't going to just snap their fingers and the phone is going to magically appear. Like you said with Star Trek, they had the technology and it evolved, but it was still tangible technology. I would definitely recommend keeping your eye on that.
Yeah, it is easy to make mistakes. I've made a few. In A Ship Possessed, I mentioned the Milton Berle show right before I have two storylines, two timelines, and one takes place in World War II, and I mentioned the Milton Berle show, and I was 2 years too early. The odd thing is I don't even remember writing that. I think I just put it in as a detail to check later, and I never checked it. I forgot all about it, but... so I was a couple of years early on that, 2 or 3 years early about that. So it's a very easy kind of thing to do, to make those mistakes. And the more you know about history, the more mistakes you'll find in other people's books. It's
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean you have to point them out. It's just everyone's going to make those kinds of mistakes.
Which is why I try to avoid writing historical fiction as much as possible, because, oh man, there's a lot of research you got to do, and there are people out there who are going to call you on it. Science fiction is that way, though, too. If you have something that doesn't make scientific sense, you're going to have some readers who are going to call you on it. So you want to make sure that you're at least in the realm of possibility, and at least with science fiction, you can explain away a couple of things. But if you've got somebody tying a shoe before there were shoelaces, there's somebody out there who's going to call you on it. The last one that we've got that we wanted to talk about tonight, the last way you can develop the time setting of your novel is the economy, and not a lot of people think about this. And generally speaking, your character is either going to be wealthy or they're going to be poor, and regardless of the current state of the economy. But the economy is very it fluctuates quite often. It's very volatile. And knowing this can help you conceptualize the world in which your character lives. If it's during the Great Depression, probably not a lot of money. Or if they do have a lot of money, the people around them don't. Or if it's during the upswing of the economy during the Silicon Valley Revolution, or the Roaring Twenties before the Depression when things were going good, going well, then maybe they've got a little bit of extra cash. You look at people like Fitzgerald, who wrote about all these people shortly after the war that had money and didn't know what to do with it, so they all just kind of hung out and got drunk together, and everybody was making money. But then we've got the Depression that hits, and now nobody has any money anymore. Does your character even play the markets? Have they lost money? Have they gained money? Is this a part of what they do? Does it affect their jobs at all? Even I don't play the stock market, but with this most recent recession, if that's what we want to call it, the economic downturn with the housing crisis in the early 2000s, and I'm working, and I'm worried about getting pink slipped at my job as a teacher, not because I was in danger of losing my home, not because I had made bad choices or was with the wrong bank, but just because everybody else was. And the economy just started crashing, and I was feeling that a little bit. Luckily, I avoided that, which is good, but if I had gotten hired 1 year later than I did, the story would have been completely different. And so perhaps their career is affected by this economy. Again, you don't have to go into depth about this, but you'll want to know it for the background information. How much money does my character have, and how much money do the characters around him or her have? Are they wealthy, or are they poor, or are they somewhere in the middle? If so, are they upper middle class or lower middle class? See, we've got all these sorts of divisions to classify people's economic well-being, and so you can show, by and large, if the economy is booming, if we've got construction projects going on and there's new growth and homes are being built, or if you've got a bunch of half-built homes that the developers were not able to finish because the economy tanked, and so now you've just got a row of houses that are all empty without roofs, or whatever the case may be. Those types of things can be kind of intriguing and add a little bit of character to your story, to the setting, the time setting of your story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does, and when you blend all these together, a good example of this, and it's fun to watch, is the Murdoch Mysteries. You can catch them on Netflix or Acorn, which is the British broadcasting, and they're wonderful, wonderful shows. And they mix all of these things together because it takes place at the turn of the century in Toronto, Canada, and people keep showing up, and that are famous. So Edison shows up a couple of times, and so does Nikola Tesla. Actors, Mark Twain shows up, and you see all these different things pulled together, and you get a little history out of it, but at the same time they have fun with it. So the detective Murdoch is always inventing some new bit of crime detection equipment. He creates something that lifts finger marks, which of course are fingerprints, and he does this over and over again. What that does is it tells us these things aren't there now. The fact that he's starting to invent some of these things tells us that a little bit about the setting, about what's going on, and makes the storyline fantastic. The coroner is a woman. She can't be a doctor because after all she's a woman, and so you see some of the struggle that goes on there. So it adds a lot of color and detail to the basic storyline, which is a murder mystery.
I like that you say that. A lot of color and detail really adds a lot. And when you read these books that have established the time of their setting very clearly, it's remarkable, and it's usually very enjoyable. I think of Slaughterhouse-Five, which takes place in part on an alien planet and an alien spaceship, but the time and ranges from the 40s and the war to up through the 60s, I believe. He just covers the gambit of time, and the progression of time is intriguing. and how he handles that. So it's another tool in your writing belt. It's another tool in your arsenal. I guess I'm mixing metaphors there. Another weapon in your arsenal, another tool in your tool belt. There we go. Um, that can really help develop your story and make your characters even more believable, really help develop them as well. So that's what we have for this week. Molly, did we have any questions, comments, concerns from the chat room?
We had a pretty active chat room tonight, so that was a lot of fun. Bruce Brady showed up, so he's kind of quiet, but
Yay.
he's always got a good sense of humor. I like it when he checks in. Tess was not able to join us. She is down in Glendale having dinner with a friend, so she'll watch later. Dave Fessenden, Marie Bast, all checked in. Mary Ruth Hughes. Mary Ruth Hughes has a new historical novel out. She just released it earlier this week, so I'm super proud of her.
Nice.
She's a really, really, really good friend of mine, and she managed to self-publish her book and get it all up and running on CreateSpace while dealing with being confined to a wheelchair because she broke her foot 2 weeks ago.
Ouch.
So, yeah, so we're talking this is a strong woman to be able to do all of that from the confines of a wheelchair. Let's see. Dave says that most people use ellipses wrong. Many people don't even know what an ellipsis is. And then, I don't know, Aaron posted some snarky comment, and we're going to just run right past that one. There was some conversation on the ellipses. Marie Bass said she considers all classics timeless. Dave Fessenden said his son was 4 years old when Reagan was running for president, and his son said, "You should vote for Ronald Reagan. He's got nice hair." So sometimes kids do follow the elections. He also says Joseph Bailey wrote a story in 1981 that was set, quote, 30 years in the future, but there was little or no change in technological advances. He said at first he disliked that, but then he began to consider it perhaps the dystopian future was stagnated technologically. I could see that. Mary Ruth Hughes again. I asked the room if they reference major world or national events in their writing. Mary Ruth says yes. Her characters go from one historical event to another in Indian territory. Marie Bass said she doesn't really reference events so much as she will just name people casually and have one of her characters meet them. For instance, Clara Barton. And Dave Fessenden said that if you can talk to somebody from the era you're writing, it really helps. He grew up in the 60s and 70s, and he can say that not everyone was wearing love beads, for instance. There was a small contingent of real hippies, but most young people dressed less extravagantly than that. He suggests avoiding the historical cliches and stereotypes. And Marie Bast mentioned that she likes to mention the economy by having a character driving an old Buick or a new Lexus just to show it instead of being so blatant about it. And that is all the comments that we have tonight.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Next week, we're going to talk about place, the thing that most people think of when they think of setting. So we'll talk a little bit about that next week. Hope you guys can join us 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on a Tuesday. Don't forget to ask the author. You can do that on Facebook or at aarongansky.com. And if you're looking for us, you can find us at altongansky.com, frankly-my-dear-mojo.com, and aarongansky.com. And we do want to give one more quick shout out here to Molly Jo on Saturday, August 20th. If you are in the Bakersfield area and you want to see her present to the writers of Kern about growing your social media swarm. I was there last month and talked about, what did I talk about? Characters. And she's going to talk this month about, I'm glad somebody was listening.
I'm sorry, was that a real question? You kept talking. I wasn't sure you wanted in it. Yes, you talked about the 4 pillars of character development, and you were very well received. And you are going to be there selling your books.
Thank you very much.
This month.
I will. They did not arrive in time for me to sell them last month, so I have them now, and I'll sell them there. So that's on August 20th if you're around the Bakersfield area, Pops, in Central California. So if you're around,
just saying,
stop on by. So,
yeah.
Well, we do thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.